Welcome to Mindset Matters Book Club YouTube channel. Please subscribe and like to hear new book summaries.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we are embarking on a deep dive today that really has the potential to fundamentally rewire how you evaluate information.
It absolutely does.
Because whether you are looking at, a flashy headline about a new health trend, or parsing a really complex quarterly earnings report, or even just trying to figure out if that new management strategy is actually working, we are putting it all under the microscope today.
Right. We are unpacking a genuinely powerhouse book today. It's the Causal Mindset Handbook by Dr. Quentin Gallea.
And the mission here, for you listening, is to acquire a shortcut. We really want to bypass the noise and give you a rigorous, structural way to become a better, more critically thinking decision maker.
Exactly. And we are going to do that by tearing down the illusion of simple cause and effect and replacing it with the actual hidden science of how things influence each other in a really messy, multifactorial world.
What's fascinating here is, I think you actually had a really good point about the historical context of this earlier.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is that if you take a macro view of human history, you see this stunning technological evolution running in parallel with a very stubborn cognitive blind spot. Consider the sheer arc of our progress. I mean, we transitioned from agrarian societies that literally sacrificed livestock to rain gods to ensure a good harvest, right?
Right. Or medieval physicians practicing bloodletting to balance bodily humors.
Exactly. All the way to a modern, interconnected society that relies on unimaginably vast data lakes and algorithmic processing. We operate under the assumption that because our tools are advanced, our reasoning is equally advanced.
But it's not.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
If you scrutinize the mechanics of our daily decision-making, we still frequently operate on deeply flawed, untested assumptions.
Like adopting diet fads.
Yeah, precisely. We adopt diet fads because one person in our social circle cut out gluten and lost 5 pounds, completely ignoring their simultaneous increase in daily exercise.
Right. We see the one variable and ignore the whole system.
Or we mandate sweeping corporate policies based on a single case study of a tech giant, assuming those specific outcomes will seamlessly transfer to a completely different industry.
We just routinely, almost reflexively, conflate mere coincidence with proven causality.
And the ancients were entirely certain about the efficacy of their rain dances, and that misplaced certainty was costly. Today, our data-driven certainties can carry catastrophic physical and financial costs if we fail to understand how to properly interrogate the evidence right in front of us.
That is the core friction we are going to explore. We assume we are living in the golden age of data, but data without a structural understanding of why things are happening is really just a highly digitized rain dance.
That's a great way to put it.
So our roadmap for this deep dive is designed to build that structural understanding from the ground up for you. We're going to start by confronting the illusion of knowledge.
Why the feeling of confidence is often inversely proportional to actual comprehension.
Exactly. From there, we need to critically examine the current artificial intelligence boom and why massive investments might be optimizing for the wrong things entirely because AI lacks a fundamental causal architecture.
And then we're getting highly practical.
We'll break down a 5-step diagnostic framework from the book that you can immediately apply to any claim you encounter.
And finally, we will tackle the ultimate challenge, which is how to operate effectively in a state of perpetual, measured uncertainty without becoming paralyzed by it.
To set the baseline, though, we need to look at a rather humbling anecdote from the author's own academic journey. It really sets the stage.
It is a profound starting point because it completely strips away the ego associated with advanced education. Dr. Gallea opens the book by recounting the conclusion of his PhD defense.
Right, you have to visualize this environment for a second. It's years of grueling, hyper-focused research, culminating in a room full of esteemed internal and external examiners.
And their sole purpose is to stress test your intellectual rigor. It is the absolute pinnacle of formal academic validation.
So at the very end of this exhaustive process, one of the examiners asks him a remarkably simple question. They ask, "What is the single most important thing you have learned during your entire PhD?"
Now, most people in that high-pressure scenario would instinctively reach for their most complex finding to justify the degree.
Oh, absolutely. You would expect a dissertation on some groundbreaking statistical theorem or a highly technical defense of a novel econometric model.
The expectation is certainly a display of absolute mastery. Instead, his response is basically an admission of limits.
Yeah.
He states that his primary takeaway wasn't a mathematical equation at all. It was a visceral realization of the sheer staggering complexity of the world.
Earning the highest possible academic credential did not furnish him with a feeling of omniscience.
No, rather, it induced a profound conservatism about what he could claim to know. It made him acutely aware of the boundaries of his own expertise and the incredibly fragile nature of proving that one variable actually causes a change in another.
He was, in effect, diagnosing his own psychological trajectory through the Dunning-Kruger effect, specifically applied to the discipline of causal inference.
Right, and most of our listeners are probably familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect in a general sense.
Yeah, the cognitive bias where people with low ability overestimate their competence.
But Dr. Gallea maps it to the specific acquisition of a causal mindset in a way that requires us to really look at the mechanics of learning.
If you visualize the standard Dunning-Kruger graph, you have actual competence on the horizontal axis and subjective confidence on the vertical axis.
And the initial learning phase doesn't produce a steady, logical increase in confidence.
It produces a severe distortion.
Exactly. You start at the origin, zero knowledge, zero confidence. But the moment you acquire a tiny fragment of information, say reading a single provocative article summarizing a complex economic study, or watching a 10-minute video essay,
Your subjective confidence just explodes upward.
you ascend to that notorious first peak, often referred to colloquially as Mount Stupid.
It's a harsh name, but it fits.
The danger of this peak is that the individual possesses just enough vocabulary to sound authoritative, but completely lacks the structural knowledge to understand the underlying mechanics or the historical context or the methodological flaws of the information they are parading around.
They mistake the acquisition of a data point for the mastery of a system.
Right.
But I wonder if that initial peak is entirely negative. I mean, isn't that burst of unwarranted confidence often the very catalyst that drives someone to actually pursue deeper learning?
That is a very fair counterpoint.
Like, if we started out completely intimidated by the complexity of a subject, we might never engage with it at all.
The initial enthusiasm definitely can serve as a primer. The critical juncture is what happens next. If the individual is complacent, they remain on that peak, confidently broadcasting flawed conclusions.
Right?
But if they possess intellectual curiosity, they continue reading. They encounter contradictory studies, they learn about confounding variables, sample size limitations, and publication bias.
And that is when the structural integrity of their initial simplified worldview collapses.
Confidence plummets drastically. It sends them into what is often termed the valley of despair.
Which is a rough place to be.
It is the stage where the sheer volume of nuance makes the individual feel as though they actually know nothing at all. Every claim seems flawed. Every study seems biased.
It's a state of complete intellectual whiplash.
Yeah.
But according to the framework in the book, surviving that valley is the prerequisite for genuine expertise. From the bottom of that trough, the individual begins the slow, deliberate climb up the slope of enlightenment.
And the crucial distinction Dr. Gallea makes here is the definition of the expert at the top of that slope.
Right. The expert is not someone who has recaptured the absolute certainty of that first peak.
Far from it. The defining characteristic of the mature expert is a profound operational respect for uncertainty.
True experts navigate the world not through absolutes, but through probabilities, confidence intervals, and conditional statements.
They are highly attuned to the limitations of their own models. They know precisely where their data ends and where their assumptions begin.
And this is exactly the mindset required to engage in rigorous causal inference. You have to strip away the false confidence of simple correlations to build a robust architecture for understanding real-world impact.
Which brings us to the immediate application for you, the listener.
Yeah, as we progress through the mechanics of causality in this deep dive, you might actually experience a microversion of this exact curve.
The concepts are going to challenge your baseline assumptions about how easily we can prove cause and effect.
You might feel a sense of skepticism creeping in regarding everything you read. That is the intended friction.
We are breaking down the reliance on simple observation to build up a much more rigorous analytical toolkit.
And there is no sector in the modern economy that requires this rigorous toolkit more urgently than the current frenzied landscape of artificial intelligence.
Oh, absolutely. The scale of capital deployment in the AI sector right now is historically unprecedented.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are witnessing an absolute gold rush, driven by a profound corporate fear of missing out, FOMO is driving the market.
Every enterprise, from legacy logistics firms to hyper-growth tech startups, is integrating large language models and machine learning algorithms into their core operations.
But Dr. Gallea poses a fundamental structural question that cuts straight through the marketing hype. And it's a million-dollar question. Is it actually working?
Is it working in a causal sense? Are these massive capital expenditures generating a true causal impact on revenue, efficiency, and growth? Or are companies simply optimizing for proxy metrics while missing the underlying mechanics of their business?
To really answer that, we have to establish a hard boundary between two concepts that the tech industry routinely conflates: prediction versus causation.
Let's elevate this beyond the standard textbook examples. We know AI is a spectacular prediction engine.
Right. If I feed a machine learning model 10 years of a company's marketing data, it can find incredibly nuanced patterns.
It can predict that when the company spends a certain amount on specific social media platforms during specific months, user acquisition spikes.
The model is minimizing loss and optimizing its weights perfectly to match historical data.
It is identifying correlations with superhuman efficiency. But the critical failure point is that the model is completely blind to the external reality generating those numbers.
It sees the movement of variables in tandem, but it possesses no inherent architecture to understand the direction of the relationship.
Or whether a completely unmeasured third variable is dictating both. It can predict an outcome based on a pattern, but it cannot tell you what will happen if you actively intervene and change a variable.
Because intervention requires an understanding of the causal mechanism.
Let's ground this in the highly publicized example from the book regarding the conversation between Donald Trump and Elon Musk about immigration numbers.
Right. The assertion was made that in January 2021, the numbers for illegal immigration at the border hit a tremendous low.
Now, the immediate correlational leap, the exact kind of leap an AI prediction engine might make, if trained only on those two specific data points, is to draw a straight line between the political administration's policies at that exact moment and the drop in the numbers.
And this is where we must apply strict analytical rigor, entirely divorced from the political charge of the topic. We are not taking a side here.
Right. The danger here is looking at a single correlation in a vacuum. If we are trying to establish a causal link that policy X directly resulted in outcome Y, we must account for the broader environment.
What else was occurring globally in January 2021?
We were in the most severe phase of a once-in-a-century global pandemic. Nations worldwide had enacted unprecedented lockdowns, severe travel restrictions, and massive economic shutdown.
Global human mobility had effectively ground to a halt.
So a causal thinker has to look at that data and ask, did the political policy cause the drop? Or did a massive global confounding variable, the COVID-19 pandemic, cause the drop?
Or was it some heavily weighted combination of both?
If you train a predictive model only on the policy dates and the border numbers, ignoring the global epidemiological data, the model will confidently predict that reinstating that exact policy will always yield that exact drop.
Completely failing to realize that the primary driver may have been a lockdown planet.
This illustrates the peril of relying on non-causal systems for high-stakes decisions. It leads to fundamental misattributions of effectiveness.
And this isn't isolated to singular events. It applies to massive, slow-moving societal shifts as well.
The book references the incredibly dense and debated work of Jonathan Haidt in The Anxious Generation.
The baseline data there is largely undisputed. Beginning around the early 2010s, there was a sharp, statistically significant decline in the mental health and well-being of adolescents globally.
The data clearly shows the decline. The infinitely more difficult task is establishing the causal driver.
For years, a prominent sociological hypothesis tied this decline to the lingering, deeply entrenched economic fallout of the 2008 global financial crisis.
The causal pathway makes logical sense. Macroeconomic instability leads to severe parental financial stress, which trickles down to create an environment of anxiety and instability for children and adolescents.
It's a highly plausible mechanism, but Haidt's thesis points to a different, concurrent, massive shift: the ubiquitous adoption of smartphones, front-facing cameras, and algorithmically driven social media platforms,
which aggressively scaled at that exact same time.
You have two monumental, globally disruptive variables overlapping in the exact same temporal window. How does a researcher untangle them?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the causal mindset demands that we abandon the search for a single, neat narrative.
We have to recognize that almost all significant phenomena in the real world are fiercely multifactorial.
Finding compelling evidence that social media algorithms exacerbate adolescent anxiety does not mathematically or logically invalidate the evidence that severe economic household stress also contributes to poor mental health outcomes.
The mechanisms can, and almost certainly do, coexist and compound one another.
Exactly.
But if everything is multifactorial, doesn't that inherently paralyze our ability to act? I mean, think about it. If a business leader accepts that a drop in sales is simultaneously caused by a subtle shift in consumer sentiment, a minor algorithm change by a search engine, a competitor's new ad campaign, and a slight downturn in the broader economy, how do they ever decide which lever to pull?
That's the fear.
Right. If we can't isolate the single most important factor, are we just making educated guesses?
It does not paralyze action. Rather, it forces a more sophisticated approach to resource allocation. You aren't searching for the sole cause. You are engaging in causal weighting.
Causal weighting.
You are trying to determine, through rigorous analysis, which of those multiple factors has the highest marginal impact and which of those factors you actually have the agency to control.
The business leader cannot control the macroeconomic downturn, but they can control their ad spend or their product pricing.
The goal is to isolate the effect size of the variable you can manipulate, holding the others as constant as possible. But as Dr. Gallea points out, achieving that isolation brings us face to face with what is known as the fundamental problem of causal inference.
And this is where the philosophy of science meets hard mathematical limits.
Right.
The fundamental problem is that to achieve absolute, undeniable proof that variable A caused outcome B, we require an impossible baseline. We would literally need access to two identical parallel universes.
It sounds like science fiction, but it is the defining constraint of all observational research.
Just lay out an example.
Suppose a government wants to definitively prove that a new, sweeping tax incentive increases national GDP. The only mathematically flawless way to prove that causality is to have Earth 1, where the tax incentive is signed into law, and an identical Earth 2, where the law is vetoed.
Because every single other atom in those two universes is moving in exactly the same way. The same weather patterns, the same global trade dynamics, and the same consumer psychology.
Any divergence in GDP 5 years later can be absolutely, indisputably attributed to that single tax law.
But we are trapped in a single timeline. We cannot observe the counterfactual reality.
We can never actually see what would have happened to the GDP if the law hadn't passed, because once it passes, the alternative reality is gone forever.
The book uses a very grounded, localized example to make this deductive nightmare visceral for us. The headache pill anecdote.
It perfectly scales down the impossibility of the parallel world.
Right, imagine you are in the middle of a high-stress workday and a severe headache begins to develop. You initially try to manage it without medication. You step away from the harsh lighting of your monitor.
You drink 2 large glasses of water. You practice some deep breathing exercises.
But the pain steadily intensifies over the next hour. Finally, conceding defeat, you take a standard over-the-counter painkiller. 45 minutes later, the headache is completely dissipated.
And the human brain, which is an aggressive pattern-matching machine, instantly formulates a causal conclusion. The pill cured the headache.
I would argue that 99.9% of people would draw that exact conclusion without a second thought. It feels entirely empirical. You took an action, you observed a result.
But if we apply the strict demands of the fundamental problem of causal inference, that conclusion is scientifically baseless.
It is deductively unproven because you lack the counterfactual.
You do not have access to the parallel timeline where you engaged in the exact same hour of stressful work, stepped away from the monitor, drank the exact same amount of water, did the breathing exercises, but did not take the pill.
What if the heavy hydration simply took an hour and 45 minutes to fully metabolize and relieve a tension headache caused by dehydration?
In that scenario, the headache was destined to fade at that exact moment, regardless of the medication.
What if the deep breathing relaxed the vascular constriction causing the pain and the pill was completely superfluous?
Or, to make it even more complex, what if the pill actually works much faster normally, but the specific type of tea you drank earlier inhibited the absorption of the medication, thereby delaying the cure?
Without the ability to observe the baseline counterfactual, determining the true causal agent among multiple simultaneous interventions is incredibly fraught.
Now, obviously, this level of paralyzing skepticism isn't how we actually navigate daily life. We would never survive if we demanded parallel universe-level proof for every minor action.
Right.
As Dr. Gallea points out, human beings are actually quite adept at localized, intuitive causal reasoning. He uses the analogy of grandparents tending to a vegetable garden.
The intuitive scientists.
A seasoned gardener doesn't need to read a peer-reviewed study on photosynthesis to know that planting tomatoes in the heavily shaded corner of the yard yields stunted, pale fruit, while planting them in direct sunlight yields massive, vibrant yields.
They have observed the relationship between sun exposure and biological growth repeatedly over decades.
Furthermore, they understand crop rotation intuitively. They know that planting heavy-feeding crops in the exact same soil plot year after year depletes specific nitrogen levels, resulting in diminishing returns.
They grasp the causal mechanism of soil exhaustion through direct, iterative observation.
That localized trial and error is highly effective for tightly constrained environments where feedback loops are relatively short and variables are somewhat limited.
The breakdown occurs when we attempt to scale that intuitive backyard logic to massive, highly complex interconnected systems.
You can iterate on tomato placement year over year. You cannot use trial and error to determine the optimal interest rate for a national economy.
Or the long-term efficacy of a global carbon tax.
Or the integration of an AI language model into a critical healthcare diagnostic system. The variables are too numerous, the feedback loops are too long, and the cost of being wrong is catastrophic.
When intuition fails to scale and parallel universes are unavailable, we are forced to rely on structured frameworks. We need a methodology to artificially construct the missing counterfactual as rigorously as possible.
And this leads us directly into the core utility of the book, the 5-step causal mindset framework.
This is the practical toolkit for evaluating the barrage of claims we face daily.
Let's really stress test this framework.
Okay, let's invent a detailed case study. Let's introduce a hypothetical colleague. We will call him Trent.
Trent is about to make a very bold causal claim.
So Trent corners you in the break room. He is vibrating with energy. He announces that for the past 45 days, he has subjected himself to a punishing regimen of 10-minute ice-cold showers every single morning.
Okay.
He then points out that during this entire 45-day period, he hasn't experienced a single day of illness. Not a sniffle, not a cough, no fatigue.
His conclusion is absolute.
Right. The cold exposure has fundamentally altered his physiology, supercharged his immune system, and directly caused his perfect health record. How do we deploy the 5 steps to dismantle or validate Trent's claim?
We begin with step 1. Identify the proxy counterfactual.
Okay.
Since we cannot observe the parallel universe where Trent took warm showers, we must determine what baseline Trent is using to make his comparison. What is his proxy for the unobservable reality?
Is he comparing his current 45 days to the 45 days immediately prior?
Is he comparing himself to the historical average of his health over the last 5 years? Or is he comparing his health to the general illness rate of the rest of the office during this exact same period?
The strength of his entire claim rests entirely on the validity of that proxy.
Yes.
If Trent is someone who has a chronically weak immune system and historically catches a severe cold every 3 weeks like clockwork, then comparing his current state to his own historical baseline is actually a fairly compelling proxy counterfactual. The deviation from his norm is significant.
But what if Trent is a hyper-healthy 20-something athlete who hasn't used a sick day in 4 years?
In that case, the proxy counterfactual completely destroys the claim. If his baseline state is perfect health, then observing 45 days of perfect health after initiating cold showers provides literally zero new causal information.
The outcome is identical to the baseline. Assuming we'd established that Trent does, in fact, usually get sick, and his current health is a genuine anomaly, we move to the most critical analytical phase.
Step 2. Question other factors.
We must actively hunt for confounders. We ask, is there something else?
We have to play the role of a skeptical detective looking for omitted variable bias. We have to look at the holistic picture of Trent's lifestyle change.
It is highly unlikely that someone who suddenly commits to the extreme discipline of daily ice showers made absolutely no other changes to their routine.
The psychological motivation required for the showers likely spilled over. What if Trent, fueled by this new health kick, also stopped drinking alcohol on weekdays?
What if he started prioritizing 8 hours of sleep instead of his usual 6?
Those are massive physiological confounders. A dramatic increase in sleep quality and a reduction in alcohol consumption are both scientifically proven to significantly bolster immune function.
The water temperature might be entirely irrelevant, simply acting as a highly visible marker for a broader unseen lifestyle shift.
We also have to look at environmental confounders.
Yeah.
What time of year is it?
If Trent started this challenge in early June and is reporting his results in mid-July, he is entirely ignoring the seasonal collapse of ambient viral transmission.
The office is no longer a petri dish of winter colds and flu variants. The something else might literally just be the teeth of the Earth's axis bringing summer weather.
Once we have generated this list of plausible confounders, sleep, diet, seasonality, we transition to step 3.
Which is where the analysis becomes highly mathematical in its logic. Step 3 is determine the bias direction.
We have to evaluate whether these hidden factors are artificially inflating the perceived effectiveness of the cold showers or masking their true power.
This step requires careful logical mapping. Let's look at the confounders you identified. Increased sleep, better diet, and summer weather.
Every single one of those factors independently pushes the outcome toward better health.
Because they all align with the desired outcome, they create a severe positive bias. They are stacking the deck.
They make the cold showers look like a miraculous intervention, when in reality, the hidden variables might be responsible for 95% of the improved immune response.
The causal effect of the cold water is almost certainly being massively overestimated.
But let's flip the scenario to understand negative bias.
Okay.
Suppose Trent undertook this 45-day cold shower challenge starting in mid-November. Suppose he works in accounting, and it's the end-of-year audit season, meaning he is working 80-hour weeks, sleeping 4 hours a night, eating terrible takeout food, and the office is ravaged by a nasty strain of the flu.
The environmental and physiological confounders are aggressively pushing the outcome toward severe illness.
Exactly. The deck is stacked heavily against him. If, under those brutal conditions, Trent still manages to maintain perfect health, that indicates a negative bias was overcome.
The confounders were actively trying to mask the effectiveness of the intervention.
In this scenario, the true causal power of the cold showers might actually be even stronger than Trent realizes, because the intervention had to fight through a barrage of negative variables to achieve the positive outcome.
Understanding the direction of the bias tells you how much you can trust the initial observation.
Once we have identified the bias, we move to step 4, refine and iterate.
This is where we attempt to tighten the proxy counterfactual to eliminate the noise of those confounders. We can't accept Trent's personal anecdote, so how do we design a more robust observation?
We have to move from individual anecdote to comparative group analysis. We need to construct a scenario where the confounders are distributed equally.
We could propose that 50 people in the office participate in a study. We ensure that all 50 are experiencing the same seasonal environment and the same general office stress levels.
We ask half of them to take cold showers and the other half to maintain their normal warm showers, while explicitly instructing both groups to keep their sleep and diet strictly consistent with their historical norms.
By refining the parameters, we are attempting to isolate the single variable of water temperature,
which is essentially mimicking the methodology of formal scientific research. But this leads to a critical point of friction.
Let's assume we do this. Let's assume we run the most rigorous, perfectly refined observation possible on Trent and his specific cohort in this specific office. And the data unequivocally proves that the cold showers caused a massive spike in immune function. We still have to execute step 5.
Extrapolate.
We have to assess the external validity of the claim.
This is the graveyard of countless promising studies and seemingly foolproof business strategies. Step 5 demands that we ask, even if this intervention worked flawlessly in this specific, highly controlled context, is it safe to assume it will work for the broader population?
Can we extrapolate the localized success to a universal application? I would argue that in health and business, blind extrapolation is incredibly dangerous.
It is. Trent is a specific biological entity. Perhaps he has a specific genetic predisposition that reacts favorably to acute thermal stress.
But if you take Trent's perfectly proven protocol and apply it to a 60-year-old colleague with chronic hypertension and a history of cardiac arrhythmia, the physiological shock of the freezing water isn't going to boost their immune system.
No, it is going to trigger a severe medical emergency. The intervention is causally effective for Trent, but it completely lacks external validity when applied to a fundamentally different baseline.
The business applications of this failure to extrapolate are ubiquitous.
We see it constantly in management theory. A hyper-agile, venture-backed software startup in Silicon Valley implements a radical, flat management structure with zero middle managers.
They experience a staggering 50% increase in deployment speed and operational efficiency. The founders write a best-selling book declaring this the definitive future of work.
A traditional, highly regulated aerospace manufacturing firm reads the book, fires all their middle managers, and their production lines grind to a catastrophic, unsafe halt.
Because the context is the hidden variable. The software startup is employing highly autonomous, adaptable engineers building digital products where failure means a software bug.
The manufacturing firm is employing specialized labor-building physical machines where failure means a structural disaster, requiring rigid oversight and quality control tiers.
The causal link between the flat structure and efficiency was real in Silicon Valley, but the external validity was zero when extrapolated to aerospace.
Precisely. And what Dr. Gallea has done to make this demanding five-step process more accessible is quite innovative. Recognizing that walking through proxy counterfactuals, confounder mapping, bias direction, refinement, and external validity is cognitively taxing, he developed a companion GenAI application.
This tool is specifically engineered to automate the diagnostic questioning process. It is a brilliant use of AI, not as a prediction engine, but as an analytical sparring partner.
The book details an example where the author used his own app to investigate a personal claim. He had started a new, highly specific rowing fitness program on an indoor machine and noticed his split times were significantly improving.
The intuitive leap is to credit the new program, but he fed the claim into the app.
And the app, operating strictly on the framework, began systematically interrogating the claim. It asked him to define his proxy counterfactual, what were his times before the program.
It forced him to identify confounders. Was he resting more between sessions? Was he eating more carbohydrates before rowing?
It essentially acts as an objective, tireless causal detective, forcing the user to map out the biases before allowing them to settle on a conclusion. It is a tool for building rigorous cognitive habits.
But while that framework is an incredibly powerful qualitative tool for navigating daily claims, we have to acknowledge its limits. It is a diagnostic heuristic, not a scientific proof.
Right.
When we're dealing with interventions that impact millions of lives, like pharmaceutical approvals, major public health policies, or billions of dollars in infrastructure spending, we cannot rely solely on a qualitative framework. We have to attempt to physically construct that impossible parallel universe.
We have to scale the absolute peak of the causal mountain. We have to transition from observational heuristics to formal experimental design.
The absolute gold standard for establishing definitive causality in the real world is the randomized controlled trial, or the RCT.
This is the methodology that underpins modern medicine and increasingly rigorous social science and economics.
Let's break down the mechanics of an RCT to understand why it is so powerful at defeating confounders. The magic lies entirely in the randomization.
If a pharmaceutical company wants to prove a new drug lowers blood pressure, they don't just give it to 100 people and see what happens.
They could take a massive, highly diverse sample pool, thousands of individuals of varying ages, genetic backgrounds, baseline health statuses, and lifestyles.
And then, crucially, they use a purely random mechanism, like a sophisticated coin flip, to divide that massive pool into two groups.
The treatment group, which receives the actual synthesized pharmacological compound, and the control group, which receives an inert placebo.
The mathematical elegance of this approach relies on the law of large numbers. Because the sorting was completely blindly random, the laws of probability dictate that all of those messy, hidden confounders we discussed earlier, stress levels, hidden genetic markers, subtle dietary habits, will be distributed almost perfectly equally between the two groups.
The randomization essentially washes out the noise. If there are 50 people with high-stress jobs who eat terrible food in the treatment group, probability ensures there are roughly 50 people with high-stress jobs who eat terrible food in the control group.
The two groups become virtually indistinguishable in their aggregate makeup. They are as close to identical parallel universes as we can possibly construct in reality.
Therefore, if the treatment group shows a statistically massive reduction in blood pressure compared to the control group, you can confidently state that the drug, the single isolated variable, was the causal mechanism.
It is the most robust tool we have. However, the application of RCTs is severely constrained by reality. This raises an important question regarding the limits of our gold standard. What happens when randomization is fundamentally impossible?
We often find ourselves in situations where conducting an RCT is either practically unfeasible, financially ruinous, or profoundly unethical.
The ethical constraint is the most glaring. If public health officials hypothesize that long-term exposure to a specific industrial chemical causes severe neurological damage, they cannot construct an RCT to prove it.
You can't not ethically take 10,000 healthy citizens, randomly assign 5,000 of them to live next to a toxic waste dump for 20 years, and force the other 5,000 to live in a pristine forest just to measure the decay of their nervous systems.
The experiment is monstrous. So if we cannot randomize and we cannot simply rely on basic correlations, how do we ever establish causality in these vital areas?
This is where the discipline of causal inference becomes truly ingenious. It introduces the realm of quasi-experimental methods.
When researchers are barred from artificially randomizing a treatment in a controlled lab setting, they look out into the chaotic observational data of the real world and hunt for anomalies.
They look for scenarios where nature, or bureaucratic policy, or sheer geographic luck has accidentally created a randomized experiment for them. They search for a natural experiment.
This is fascinating. One common method is exploiting an arbitrary cutoff point, often referred to as a regression discontinuity.
How does that actually work in practice?
Imagine a government wants to know if providing a massive, intensive tutoring intervention genuinely causes higher lifetime earnings for students. They can't afford to give it to everyone, and they can't ethically randomize it.
So they institute a rule. Only students who score below a 50 on a standardized test receive the intervention.
Exactly. So the test score is the strict boundary line. Now, if you compare a student who scored a 20 with a student who scored a 90, you learn nothing about the tutoring.
The student who scored a 90 is likely fundamentally different in terms of baseline academic preparation, household resources, and prior education. They are full of confounders.
But if you look very, very closely at the arbitrary cutoff line, the score of 50-something magical happens.
Let's see where this is going. You look at the student who scored a 49 and the student who scored a 51.
Exactly. From a statistical and practical standpoint, a student who scores a 49 and a student who scores a 51 are virtually identical.
The 2-point difference is essentially random noise. Maybe one student slept slightly worse the night before, or guessed wrong on a single multiple-choice question.
They share the same baseline competence, yet because of the rigid bureaucratic rule, the student with the 49 receives the massive, life-altering tutoring intervention, and the student with the 51 receives absolutely nothing.
The bureaucratic rule has accidentally randomized the treatment at the boundary line.
The student with the 51 becomes the perfect, naturally occurring control group for the student with the 49.
If 10 years later, the students who scored 49 are earning significantly more money than the students who scored 51, you have isolated the causal impact of the tutoring, completely bypassing the ethical and financial barriers of a formal RCT.
It requires incredibly sophisticated statistical modeling to ensure the boundary is truly random and not manipulated, but when executed correctly, quasi-experiments allow us to extract rigorous causal truths from messy historical data.
They allow us to prove the impact of minimum wage laws by looking at adjacent counties across state lines, or the impact of environmental regulations by looking at wind patterns downwind of factories.
But even if we master these tools, even if we execute a flawless quasi-experiment or fund a perfect massive RCT and our statistical models are absolutely unimpeachable, the book introduces a massive final trapdoor.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
We can do all the math perfectly, isolate the causality without a shadow of a doubt, and still be disastrously, catastrophically wrong in our real-world application.
This is the concept of the type 3 error, and it is arguably the most insidious trap for highly intelligent, highly analytical organizations.
In standard statistical hypothesis testing, we worry about type 1 and type 2 errors. A type 1 error is a false positive. You conclude an intervention works when it actually doesn't like believing Trent's cold showers work when it was actually the summer weather.
A type 2 error is a false negative. You conclude an intervention failed when it actually worked, perhaps because your sample size was too small to detect the subtle effect.
But a type 3 error bypasses the math entirely. The math is right. The causality is real. A type 3 error occurs when you provide the perfectly correct mathematical answer to the completely wrong question.
It is an error of operational aim. You have aimed your incredibly powerful analytical sniper rifle at the entirely wrong target. And the primary driver of type 3 errors is a phenomenon known as Goodhart's law.
Goodhart's law is a fundamental principle of economics and systems theory. It states, very simply, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that. because it explains so much organizational dysfunction. If a hospital administrator wants to improve the quality of patient care, a nebulous, difficult-to-quantify goal, they might decide to measure it by tracking the wait times in the emergency room.
Initially, this is a decent proxy metric. Shorter wait times generally correlate with better organization and faster care.
But the moment the administrator ties the doctors and nurses' financial bonuses or job security to hitting a specific hard target for wait times, say, every patient must be seen within 15 minutes, the metric ceases to be a measure of quality.
It becomes the sole objective. The hospital staff, behaving completely rationally within the incentive structure, will begin optimizing for the metric at the expense of the actual goal.
They will rush through complex diagnoses, discharge patients prematurely, or reclassify severe cases to less urgent wards just to stop the clock.
The causal link is undeniable. The new bonus policy definitively caused wait times to drop. The math is perfect, but it is a massive type 3 error because the true goal, patient health, likely plummeted.
The administration solved the wrong problem. And Dr. Gallea scales this concept up from hospital waiting rooms to the level of international policy, using a profoundly impactful example regarding Swiss agriculture and environmental regulation.
The Swiss agriculture example perfectly encapsulates the danger of optimizing a flawed metric on a global scale. The overarching noble goal is to combat global climate change.
To operationalize this, a government must select a metric to target. In this scenario, policymakers chose to target territorial emissions.
This metric strictly measures the volume of greenhouse gases physically generated within the geographical borders of the nation.
It seems logical at first glance. You want to reduce carbon, so you measure the carbon coming out of your own smokestacks and tractors. To hit this target, the government implements highly aggressive, restrictive policies on domestic agriculture.
They mandate massive reductions in the use of specific fertilizers, they limit the size of dairy herds, and they restrict land use.
And let us assume the enforcement is perfect. A few years later, the statisticians run the numbers, and the quasi-experimental data is clear. The restrictive policies caused a direct, massive reduction in the carbon emitted by Swiss farms.
The territorial emissions metric plummets. The policymakers hold a press conference, declare the intervention a resounding, causally proven success, and celebrate their contribution to fighting climate change.
They have perfectly answered the question. Did our policy lower territorial emissions?
But they committed a catastrophic type 3 error because they ignored the broader system. The population of Switzerland did not suddenly require 30% fewer calories. The domestic demand for food remained entirely constant.
If the local farmers are producing significantly less yield because of the restrictive fertilizer laws, that massive shortfall in the food supply has to be filled.
Exactly. The supermarket shelves do not stay empty. The food is simply imported. It is purchased from agricultural sectors in developing nations or regions with vastly inferior, highly polluting environmental regulations.
Not only are those foreign farms generating more carbon per ton of food produced, but that food must now be transported across continents via heavy-emitting cargo ships and diesel trucking fleets.
So if we look at the metric that actually matters to the Earth's atmosphere, global consumption emissions, which tracks the total carbon footprint of the food, the population that actually consumes, the numbers didn't go down.
They almost certainly went up. The policy successfully reduced emissions within a tiny, artificially drawn geographical box. But the net causal effect on the global climate was negative.
The emissions weren't eliminated, they were outsourced and amplified.
The causal math proving the local reduction was flawless. The metric was a disaster. By making territorial emissions the absolute target, the policymakers optimized a blind spot. They solved for the spreadsheet, not the atmosphere.
This is the ultimate danger of complex systems. You can use perfect causal inference to prove you pulled a lever, but if the lever is disconnected from the engine or connected to the wrong gear, your perfect math just accelerates a failure.
That concept that we can be perfectly right about the math and disastrously wrong about the outcome brings us to a pivotal moment in this deep dive. I want to address you, the listener, directly.
We have spent the last hour systematically dismantling the scaffolding of how most people interpret information.
We have shown how compelling correlations are often mirages. We have highlighted the impossibility of true parallel worlds, the incredibly high bar for experimental proof, and the terrifying reality that even perfectly executed data science can lead to destructive type 3 errors if the metrics are flawed.
If you are feeling a profound sense of skepticism, or perhaps even a mild sense of intellectual vertigo right now, That is the correct response.
You have successfully navigated the descent from Mount Stupid, you have waded through the valley of despair, and you are currently standing at the base of the slope of enlightenment.
But it is absolutely vital that you do not stop here. The objective of Dr. Gallea's work and of our rigorous deconstruction today is not to strand you in a state of permanent paralyzed cynicism.
Yes, because total cynicism, the reflexive belief that because all data has flaws, no data can be trusted, and therefore all decisions are equally arbitrary, is just a different flavor of ignorance. It is intellectual cowardice masquerading as wisdom.
The true goal of developing a causal mindset is to harness the empowering nature of calibrated doubt.
Doubt is not a mechanism for destruction. It is a mechanism for calibration. When you are presented with a massive new corporate initiative, a sweeping political promise, or a revolutionary health claim, you are no longer forced into a binary choice of blind acceptance or blind rejection.
You now possess a highly sophisticated structural filter. You can demand the proxy counterfactual, you can actively map the confounders, you can mathematically assess the direction of the bias, you can question the external validity of the sample size.
You are elevating your perspective above the flat, two-dimensional world of simple correlations. Yes, the realization that the world is fiercely complex and inherently multifactorial is humbling. Absolute 100% certainty is almost always an illusion sold by marketers and demagogues.
But understanding causality is the art of operating effectively within that uncertainty. You are trading the fragile, false confidence of ignorance for the robust, tested competence of critical analysis.
You are equipping yourself to weigh probabilities, acknowledge unavoidable trade-offs, and make decisions that, while perhaps never perfect, are mathematically and logically far more likely to succeed.
It demands a fundamental shift in how we interact with authority and data. It means we have an obligation to demand better evidence architectures.
When an enterprise AI system predicts a market outcome, we must interrogate the causal assumptions embedded in its training data.
When leadership claims a victory based on a specific metric, we must relentlessly ask if that metric is actually aligned with the terminal goal, or if they are simply optimizing a type 3 error.
We must embrace the reality that our models are always provisional, always subject to refinement as new variables emerge.
I think that is the perfect distillation of the causal mindset, and it leads directly into the final provocative thought we want to leave you with today.
We've spent a lot of time discussing how poorly chosen metrics can obscure reality, like the Swiss territorial emissions, and how our massive new AI systems are fundamentally optimization engines that ruthlessly maximize whatever targets we feed them.
The intersection of those two concepts is where the future will be decided.
Exactly. So here's the thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends. If our metrics entirely define our operational reality, and our incredibly powerful, rapidly scaling AI systems are learning exclusively from the flawed human-selected metrics we choose to prioritize, are we actually building an artificial intelligence that understands the complex causal nature of our world? Or are we currently investing trillions of dollars to build a system that will perfectly efficiently and at a scale beyond human comprehension optimize our own blind spots?
If we allow AI to optimize for engagement without a causal understanding of human psychology, or if we allow it to optimize for a flawed economic metric without understanding the downstream supply chain consequences, the scale of our self-inflicted type 3 errors will be historically unprecedented.
Cultivating a rigorous causal mindset is no longer just an academic exercise or a neat trick for challenging a colleague in a meeting. It is rapidly becoming the essential cognitive survival skill for the algorithmic age.
That is a staggering reality to confront, but also an incredibly empowering challenge to take on.
That is all the time we have for today's extensive exploration. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Causal Mindset Handbook. We hope you are leaving this conversation feeling a lot less certain about your initial assumptions, but infinitely more confident in your structural ability to tear down claims and figure out the truth.
Take this framework, take the 5 steps out into your life. The next time you're reading a bold headline or sitting in a strategy meeting, don't just look at the data, look at the mechanism.
Start asking the hard questions. Embrace the complexity of the world. Stay rigorous, stay curious, and we will see you on the next deep dive.